Thank you so much for inviting me. Many years ago, when I was a student at a university, a famous writer visited, and we asked her, a group of writers, what is your new book? What are you working on? And she said, "Girls, never ever talk about your own research. Nothing is more boring." So today, I'm going to talk about my research for this book. But I also remember my dear friend, the late Renard Strickland, told me about a writer, egotistical writer, who was going on and on about himself, and finally he stopped and said, talking all about me, let's talk about you. Which of my books is your favorite? So I'm also going to be talking about my favorite current book, which is A Life on Fire. I love everything about this cover that University of Oklahoma Press did. I love the colors. They worked with me on the title. Now, this is an earlier picture of Kate in the late 1890s with this big fashionable hat. When she took office and when she was so active working, she dressed far more plainly, always fashionable, not always tidy, but in dark, serious colors. And she's famous for saying, she wore no jewelry, she's famous for saying, "How can women wear diamonds when babies cry for bread?" Which tells you a whole lot about Kate Barnard. I believe she's the most important woman in Oklahoma history. And when I've given quite a few talks about her since this book came out, and I asked the audiences, how many have heard of her? How many here? Wow, that's huge. Usually 3 is a big number. So my question is then, if she's so important to state history, why have we not heard more about her? The question people ask me is, how did I come to write this book? And why did it take so long? Almost 50 years. That's a good question. Well, here's how I came to write it, and I tell this in the book. When I was in my 30s and working at the University of Tulsa, they brought Dr. Angie Deboe to be a guest speaker. I had never heard of her. I'm from Oklahoma. I didn't know much about state history. And she spoke, and she was this tiny woman with a fluff of white hair. You could barely see her over the podium, but she talked with such strength and integrity about the importance of history and the accuracy of history. I was just mesmerized. So I wrote her a letter in Marshall, and she replied, and we became good friends and close friends and sort of my mentor. I was in my mid-30s, she was in her mid-80s. And we were friends until she died. Now, a Tulsa newspaper did a story about this book, and I was telling them how I came to write the book, because Dr. Deboe, once when I was visiting her in Marshall, said, "I wish you'd write a book about Kate Barnard." And I promised that I would, and started in the 1970s. And she said, "The place to begin your research is tracing my footnotes in And Still the Waters Run." And that's what I did. I went to Washington, D.C., to Library of Congress, National Archives, came here to the libraries, University of Oklahoma. So I was telling this to the reporter at the Tulsa World, and when the story came out, he's not a historian, and I showed him my 9 bankers' boxes of notes and materials. That after I quit working full-time, I pulled these out 5 years ago and started rewriting the book. So I told him this story, but he's not a historian, and he didn't quite understand what I said, and he reported that Dr. Deboe had given me all of her research, and that's what I wrote the book from. I was mortified to think that anybody would think I wrote it from somebody else's research, but not as horrified as Dr. Deboe would have done. We were very close, and I gave her lots of little gifts, a sweater and stuff. She never gave me anything, even one of her books. But she gave me great professional writer's advice. She said, she had kind of a little scratchy voice then. She said, Levi Strauss doesn't give away his overalls, don't give away your books. And I would send her things I'd written in magazines, and she would comment. She was very supportive, not just of me, but of all writers and of all historians. And one time, she was not coddling. One time I sent her an article that I'd written in print already, and she replied, not your best work. So why it took so long when I started this in the 70s is because life gets in the way. Jobs change, life changes. And why did I keep at it is the question. Because as I discovered more and more, I came to have such admiration for Kate Barnard. And I wanted to keep my promise to Dr. Deboe and to myself. Dr. Deboe told me about hearing Kate speak. When Dr. Deboe was a teacher for a territorial school, when she was still virtually high school herself, she said, on those prairies, teachers walked in grandeur among us. She wanted so much to be a teacher. And she heard Kate speak at a territorial teachers meeting. And she said, she told me about her voice. She said, I've never known anybody to have to capture an audience like that. She had a magnetism. She said FDR had it, Amy Semple McPherson had it. Said she had a voice like a bell, a gift of speaking like some people have a gift of song. And this was a very important feature for Kate's success because she spoke to audiences of 2,000, 5,000, 8,000, and somehow her voice would carry. And she spoke with such passion. Dr. Deboe said her compassion burned like a flame, and you could see it when she spoke. Well, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, all history is biography, and I believe Kate's biography is the history of Oklahoma. She was born in 1875 in Nebraska, grew up in Kansas, and came here right before statehood with her father. If people know her at all, except for this group, they know her as her title, Commissioner of Charities and Corrections, first woman elected to state office. Well, that is a noun, I think. That's what she was. I think she was a verb, and she was what she did. She was a very active, not just politician, but social reformer. She was, in her day, the most popular Oklahoman in the country, the most quoted Oklahoman. And she saw to that because she wrote for national publication. She spoke to national audiences. She was also the most feared politician in Oklahoma for a while. And at the Shawnee Convention, planning for statehood, she was instrumental in combining farmers' bloc and labor union to make the most powerful farmer union bloc in history at the time. And they swept through the Constitutional Convention and wrote, she was instrumental in that. She wasn't a delegate, she couldn't vote. She went as a secretary and sort of wormed her way in. But she had been on the stump, getting a great deal of these men elected to be representative at the Constitutional Convention. And she was there to remind them that she got them elected and to remind them that they promised to put her planks in the Constitution, and they did. And national press converged on Guthrie those weeks, those months, when the Constitution was being written. And when it was done, they proclaimed it the most progressive Constitution in the nation. This baby state was the most progressive state in the Union. Now think about that. Progressive, Oklahoma. We don't put those words together much anymore. So in the Constitution, they created one office that could be held by either sex, meaning Kate could hold it. It was created essentially for her. Now, many believe that it was created, the Commissioner of Charities and Corrections, as sort of a thank you to her, thank you for helping get us elected, a pat on the head, and now she could go her way. They did not know Kate Barnard, as we know her today. She was mandated to investigate and make recommendations for every charitable and correctional institution in the state. Jails, city and county, orphanages, hospitals. There were more than 300 of them. And when she took office, she had a staff of one, a secretary. And without permission, she hired an assistant, too. Well, she was known nationally because of her progressive reform as the good angel of Oklahoma. But she tore through these institutions with such fierce determination, her department became known as the hell-raising department. She could be a good angel, but she could be an avenging angel, too. And the corrections she was recommending just seemed naturally humane to us, that the jails have water for the prisoners. Because she said in one, what if these men get thirsty? And the sheriff said, I reckon they don't get thirsty. There were 50 crammed in a space for 12. In one jail she inspected, there was a hog in there with them. When she investigated Lansing Prison, where Oklahoma Territory prisoners were sent, she found boys, 17, working in the mines, being abused, shackled to the walls if they couldn't meet their quota of coal. One of her first biggest campaigns in office were the two states' mental hospitals, which were barbaric. And she said over and over, they are patients, they are ill. This is a hospital. You may not beat them with soapy towels telling them to be good. You may not put them in wooden cribs and spray them with water and say, I'll let you out now if you behave. They're to be treated as patients. She was known especially for her care for children, and she was adamant that Oklahoma become a state with child labor laws that prohibited child labor. Before she was elected, she persuaded the Daily Oklahoman to send her on a research trip from Chicago through St. Louis, that area. And she visited mines where the children worked, and factories and mills. And when she went on the stump for the Constitution and for the delegates, she told the audiences what she'd seen. And she told them with drama and emotion. She went down in the mines to see the children working as young as 13. Ages 6 or 7, they could work above mines. But I think 12 or 13 to go down. And she told her audiences, down, down, down in the inky depths where no sunshine, where no flowers grow, that's where we put our children. She was very religious, good Catholic girl. And she said, what would our Savior say if he came to earth and saw that we are coining silver from our children's lives? Now, she spoke so well and so popularly to the mining community. And they wanted a better life for their children. They did not want their children in the mine. And they all began to call her our Kate. This is our Kate. She talked about the mills and the factories where she saw the raggedy girls working. And she talked about a bottling factory she'd inspected. And the floor walker went up and down the aisles, looking at the girls intently in the face. She said, why are you doing that? What are you looking for? And he said, they're bottling arsenic. When their lips turn white, I take them outside for a breath of air. She was very tiny, 5 feet tall, never married, chose never to marry, a mass of black hair in a big pompadour bun that was usually coming undone, blue eyes. when she spoke, and Dr. Deboe heard her say this, sometimes she would raise one arm above her head and say, I weigh only 90 pounds, but as long as God lets me live, and she repeated it like a mantra, as long as God lets me live, I will fight for these children. So you see, no wonder the people loved her. She knew everybody. William Jennings Bryan, she called him Billy. He asked her to campaign for him nationally when he ran for president. Ida Tarbell wrote her a little fan letter. She met President Roosevelt. She corresponded with William White, Allen White. So the issues that she identified, that she campaigned so hard for, were education, compulsory education, child labor laws, penal reform, mental health care, labor laws for safety and for a livable wage so men could take care of their families, the poor. And then she took on the Indian question. Now look at those issues. In her day, when she was so popular, the state was lifted up as being progressive in those same issues. Those issues are still in the news today, aren't they? But now we're at the bottom of the nation in our care for those. When she was growing up in Kansas, she was there till she was about 17. She heard Mary Elizabeth Lease speak, very big, fierce public speaker. She was advocating for rights for farmers against big business. And she said when she spoke, farmers, you need to raise more hell and less corn. At the Shawnee Convention, this is where I think Kate made her first public speech, she heard Mother Jones speak. Mother Jones was a union activist, tiny little woman wearing a black bonnet, could outswear any miner, fierce, and she was speaking for unionization because that seemed to be the salvation of the people, the poor, for livable wages. And she heard Shawnee Mother Jones say, what we need to do, men, is pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. Now, Kate heard both of these, and she sort of, I think, absorbed those speaking styles. But the most influential speech she heard was at the St. Louis World's Fair before statehood. And she had tried several occupations. She'd tried being a school teacher. She didn't really have the patience for that. She tried being a secretary. She was good at that, speedy, typing, shorthand. She had no trouble finding a job, but she had lots of trouble keeping a job because she would come in and start bossing around. We need to change this and do it this way. So she was looking for, her ambition was overflowing the job she had. But at the St. Louis World's Fair, there were exhibits of social reform to alleviate the ills of the Industrial Revolution. And she saw those, and she heard at the last big symposium Jane Addams speak. Ordinary-looking woman, kind of stocky, but she spoke to this big audience about Aristotle, Browning, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and some criminals I've known, and got a huge standing ovation. And I know Kate thought at that moment, I can do that. I can move an audience like that. And she could. She was a master of the press. She was a master of speaking to audiences. And then she took on, she was doing okay. She was making progress. She was making enemies along the way because every time she criticized an institution, that meant money to whitewash it, change it, hire more people. She was criticizing the administrators who were political appointees. She was making some enemies, but she was making progress. But then she took on what was called then the Indian question. And she took it on at the request of the superintendent of the Indian agencies and from Senator Thomas Gore in Washington, who wrote her when she took office, would you look into an egregious situation in Oklahoma about the properties of Indians, especially Indian orphans? Now, this is the subject, the Indian question, that crossed with Dr. Deboe's research. Dr. Deboe idolized Kate Barnard, and I think she saw in her something she aspired to. Here's a single woman. Dr. Deboe never married, chose not to. She was driven to be a professional woman. She saw Kate's rise to fame, she said, so fast, and then she saw Kate's career crash. But when she was researching And Still the Waters Run, she came across, in all of the documents she was reading in the basements of libraries and courthouses, the names of the men who were swindling the Indians out of their property. And what she told me about that research, she said, this is for Still the Waters Run, she said, everything I touched about that research was slimy. And sometimes sitting in those basements writing her notes, she said, I felt a real sense of fear. Because when she went out to the public street and picked up the newspapers, like in Muskogee, there were those same names, prominent men with a lot of power. Dr. Deboe's goal in life was to be a college professor, and she never achieved it. She went to the University of Chicago, made straight A's through her master's. Her dissertation was highly praised, Ward published, and they had 30 applications that year for college professors. 29 of them said, we won't take a woman under any circumstance. And the other one said, we'll take a woman if there's nobody else. And it was crushing. Dr. Deboe said, my future was just slammed shut. There was no opportunity. She worked for teachers' colleges. She worked in museums. She worked as director of maps. She taught summer school. But she decided that the way to make a living for her with serious scholarship was to be a writer. She said that was it was a level playing field. No favors, that's all I wanted. But it was a hard life. Shirley Lewie wrote her biography, and she relates a lot about this. Dr. Deboe was in her 50s when she was still trying to find a job as a college professor. And some years were so hard. I mean, here she was trying to be a freelance scholarly writer during the Depression, a single woman. And some years were so hard, she wrote one letter to Dr. Dale, pleading for his help to find a job, saying, at least I have enough to eat this year. I can't say that about last year. And she told me there was a period of time, almost 6 years, when she was in such despair, she really didn't care if she lived. So she wrote And Still the Waters Run. And she had that, and she had her Choctaw history, neither published. And she presented And Still the Waters Run manuscript to University of Oklahoma Press, who wanted to publish it, but Dr. Deboe named names too. And many of them were still living. And some of them were friends of the university. And it threatened to destroy the university press. Alfalfa Bill Murray was governor, and he was already toying with the idea of cutting funding to higher education. So all they needed was this incendiary publication. So I think in a heroic gesture, she decided the state of Oklahoma needs a press more than it needs my book. And so she pulled it. Joseph Brandt, the editor, the head of the press, left in a couple of years, went to Princeton, and one of the first books he published was hers. And she said, when it came out, she said, I didn't hear a peep from any of those men. And she said, I think it was because they knew I knew more than I had written. So when she was researching at Still the Waters Run, she saw the calamity to the Indian lands, and she saw the swindle, and she saw the names and the embezzlement. And here's how she described it. And it was an orgy. The period was when the tribal lands were being wrested from the Indians after allotment into the hands of white ownership or private ownership, mostly white, sometimes mixed bloods. And Dr. Deboe described it this way. It was an orgy of plunder and exploitation unparalleled in American history. There was a national magazine story written at the time calling it Oklahoma's Great Shame. And here is the problem. In eastern Oklahoma, in Indian Territory, and this was only the Indian children under the age of 18, 60,000 children owned 1/3 of the property. It was land that was rich in timber and coal and asphalt, and oil was coming. And it totaled about that time about $155 million. In today's money, that would be $4,650,000,000. And it seemed just easy for the taking. So how was it swindled? This is what Angie discovered. And this is what Kate discovered. Her inspectors looked at all of these land cases and began taking the guardians to court to return the properties, because all of this land was probated by the county judges. All the Indians' children had to have a legal guardian. Many adults as well, if they were declared incompetent, which could mean they didn't speak English. My little property in Oklahoma had the allottee was John W. Perryman, 3 months old. He had a legal guardian. Well, the legal guardians often were as crooked as a dog's hind leg. They were appointed by the judges. There were kickbacks. There was money. And here's how the land was being swindled. Sometimes embezzled, sometimes by lying, sometimes by forgery, sometimes by bogus marriages. This was on my abstract, where a young Indian boy, say 17, was married by his guardian to a woman they just met over at the train station, taken to the Justice of Peace. He signed over his property rights, and the woman went away with $30. And the Indian boy, one of these cases was a Muskogee Creek boy, had $30 himself for his property, went down and bought some new clothes. It breaks your heart to see the innocence of that. So there were bogus marriages. There was murder. Several houses were blown up with dynamite. And there was kidnapping of the children until they turned 18 and signed. But in the euphemism of the day, it was called spirited away. The youth were spirited away. One of the cases Kate's attorney tried was some Creek teenagers that were promised a hog-stomping good time if they'd go over to Arkansas for a few weeks. And they said, "Did you have a good time?" "Pretty good time, drank a lot of beer," then brought back and signed their property over. Most of the youth were taken to Colorado or Arkansas or Texas, but there was one case, it was a Muskogee Creek boy whose parents were more educated and had more connections, and they contacted the national authorities. The father was a member of the Masonic order, they tracked him down in England, and he was in the custody of an employee of Thomas Gilchrist. Now, that name means a lot more in East Oklahoma than it does here, maybe. Thomas Gilchrist of Gilchrist Museum. And they brought him home. There were many, and I report that in my book. there were more cases involving another great Tulsa area icon, Charles Page, who seemed to not only spirit people away, kidnap maybe the women and hold them until they signed their lease. And I name his name in my book. And it brings more outrage than Thomas Gilchrist. How could you say that about Charles Page? All the good he did, the orphanage, the Williams, the mother's home. How could you even put his name in? I think, well, two things can be true at the same time, can't they? McDonald's could sell unhealthy food and still fund the Ronald McDonald House, maybe. Balzac said, behind every great fortune, there's a great crime. And I asked Dr. Strickland what he thought about this. How many oilmen, how many Tulsans, especially in Tulsa, knew about all of this embezzlement, knew about the swindling, knew what was going on in Osage Nation? Kate sent her inspector to Osage Nation, and he wrote back, this is a grievous situation here. It needs a law. This was 10 years before the FBI came in to investigate the Reign of Terror. And Barnard said, he was speaking as a lawyer now, which is just like this way. He said, well, you don't build great museums or beautiful buildings without money. And in Oklahoma, you don't get money without oil. And you don't get oil without Indians. So much of it is built on disreputable means. This is much bigger news in Tulsa area than it is here, probably. Tulsa sits in Muskogee Nation. We abut Cherokee Nation and Osage Nation. We are keenly aware of what the tribes are doing and how they're investing in health and education and roads. And now more and more research is being done into how the property, how the land under our feet came to be in the hands of white people from the Indians. And I think Russell Cobb is here, has written about this, and I think we will be reading much more about this. I heard recently that the reason there's so many Creek orphanages, it was that Charles Page warehoused the orphans and then auctioned them off. Here's a boy 17 who will give me, here's one that's 16 and a half. I think we're going to be reading a lot more about that. And I think that's okay. We can't correct our history until we know what it is. I am very pleased to have the E.E. Dale Award. He was Dr. Deboe's mentor and suggested the theme for And Still the Waters Run. And she was very respectful of him. They always butted heads. But in Shirley Leckie's book, she pointed out that as helpful as he was in writing, she was always scrambling to get a fellowship. She took out a loan on her life insurance, anything to support herself. He would write letters in support. But as Shirley Leckie pointed out, he didn't hire her on his faculty. He may have written letters to other universities, teachers, colleges, but he didn't hire her. So the question, there's, again, two things can be true at the same time. He helped her a lot, but did he help her as much as he could have? It was still an era of sexism in academia. I'm so happy that doesn't exist anymore. When I give talks and to book clubs and groups, especially women, are not just angry, they are outraged that they didn't know about Kate Barnard's life. How, they said, can we live in Oklahoma? What kind of history are we taught that we don't know about her work? How can we not know about the Indian lands and what happened to it? Why were we not taught? And then they go into the next question. Now that we do know, what can we do? This week, I talked to a group and a woman on the front row whom I knew said, Kate Barnard was elected, first woman elected to state office in 1907. When was the second woman elected? I didn't know. She did. 1979. Who was it, I said, walking right into the punchline. Norma Eagleton, Corporation Commission. It's 1979. And so Ms. Eagleton said, what can we do to make more awareness about Kate Barnard? A Kate Barnard Day? Do we raise funds to make a better memorial for her at the hospital, over at the cemetery? It's a very small little gravestone. I couldn't find it. What do we do? What do we do now that we know? Dr. Ben Lindsay, who was one of Kate's advisors from Colorado, said she had so much influence in the state, she became a marked woman and had to go. So the fourth legislature wanted to dismantle her office, but they couldn't because it was created by the Constitution. But what they could do was cut appropriations. And so they did. Just down to a little travel fund, her salary, and a secretary, which means she had no staff to do any investigations or lawsuits or hearings. So now the doors were open for the plunder. The last big campaign she had was a national campaign that she undertook at the request of the former Secretary of the Interior. He said, will you take the story of what's going on in Oklahoma with the Indians nationally? Because the only hope we have, if the state won't correct this situation in probate, is for the federal government to take it back on. So she did that. And her last great speech was at Lake Mohonk up in New York. And she told the audience, this was the Friends of the Indians, she told them all about her career, how she'd never lost an election, how she'd had this fight and won this. And they said this, in spite of this, the Democrats are saying, Kate, you're ruining your political future with this fight. And my answer is, I can't ruin it because the youth of Oklahoma, seeing the fight that I am making when I am dead, will take up the banner when I drop it and march upward toward the heights. No battle for justice was ever lost. Well, the fourth legislature ruined her department. Her health was already bad. It ruined her life. She became a recluse and died in 1930 in a hotel in Oklahoma City, alone, age 55. But even then, she was vowing to regain her health and run for U.S. Senate. So I thank all of the people who helped me with this research, the foot soldiers in Kansas who went out into the little libraries and schools and found records. I thank Dr. Deboe for telling us first about Kate Barnard. And with my heart, I thank Kate for giving her life to the state of Oklahoma. Thank you all.